Welcome back to Mastering Next.js. In this module, we're going to be talking about React and doing a quick React overview to get you up to speed on some of the newer features of React that you may or may not know about. Now, if you're already very experienced with React, you can skip this module if you'd like. You can also use it as a brief refresher, but we're going to cover just some basic topics like the difference between classes and functional components. We'll talk about what props are, what state is, and how to use it, how we can use new React hooks to achieve the same thing, and we'll sprinkle in some ES6 features of JavaScript that you should know about, as well as how to use JSX. So let's dive right in. On the right here, I've got a very simple Next.js application started up, and all it's doing is rendering out Mastering Next.js. We're going to start from here and build out a very simple React class component, and then I'm going to show the difference between a class component and a functional component. So first things first, let's import React, and let's make a new class of a list. So this class is going to extend the React component class, and we're going to want it to render out a few different items. So let's say that we want it to render a unordered list, and it's going to have a few different list items. We'll say learn React. How about learn Next.js? Question mark. And eventually you will profit. Now we want to export this list that we created. And you see I'm getting a lint error because it's saying that this component should be written as a stateless function, which is what I'm going to show. But for now, I'm just going to disable this. And let's save. And we see this list rendered out over here on the left. So if I inspect, we can see we have an unordered list and we have the 4 list items underneath it. Very, very simple application. This is the most basic React component that you can get. It's just rendering a couple things to the DOM. And the syntax that I'm using, that I'm returning, is JSX, which it's kind of like HTML inside of your JavaScript. So this unordered list tag corresponds to this unordered list DOM element. So now let's look at turning this into a functional component. I'm going to keep what we're returning here and get rid of all of this. And we're going to say, we're going to define a new list. And we're going to use an arrow function and then return that same body and then export it at the bottom. So if we refresh, we're going to see the exact same thing. So I mentioned what an arrow function, and really this arrow function is just another way to write functions in React, but there's a few little differences. And we don't have to worry about them as much, especially as I show moving forward using hooks. But they allow you to have a little bit more, simplified functions. And then they also have implicit returns. So as you see right here, I didn't have to say return this. It just knows how to do that. And we won't have to worry about the this syntax, which you're going to see here in a minute, which can get a little annoying with class components. So this is really basic. Now let's move on to adding some extra functionality like props and state. So props, short for properties, are essentially like variables that you can pass into your React components to make them do different things. So for this list, maybe instead we don't want to define what the items are going to be in the component. We want to pass in some options or an array of options, and then we're going to render those out as list items, which would allow us then to reuse this component in a couple different places. So To pass in props, you would have something like props here, and then instead of having explicitly for list items, we can iterate over the items that we pass in and render those out to the screen. So let's say that we want to do props.items, and those are going to be the items that we pass in, and we want to map over them. Now inside of here, we're going to have access to one of those items. We're going to use the arrow function, and we're going to say, okay, for each item, we have context of the item, and let's put this on the screen. So rather than doing each one of these individually, we can move a list item into here. And instead of having this hard-coded text, we can say, I want the item text. Now one gotcha is it's saying when doing iterators, you need to have a key as an attribute on the component. And this is so React knows how to intelligently re-render these components. So now this will do the same thing as explicitly defining what list items are in this component with the flexibility to reuse this component in other places and pass in different props. So now if I had another component like a list container, and all this thing did was render a list, but it took in some items, we can put those items inside here. So learn React, learn Next.js, and then close that. Okay, and now instead, let's put this list container on the screen. So you'll see the only difference here is that I added an exclamation point on profit. So you can see that it's working, it's slightly different, but now you could technically have a bunch of different lists if you want. And you're giving this component the flexibility to take in a number of different things. We can make this even a little bit more clean using an ES6 feature, which is destructuring. So props is an object. It could be anything, but right now it's just an object that looks like this. And we can take this and say, well, the only property of this object that we care about is items. So let's destructure props and pull items out. And this will allow us to get rid of the props dot notation, which you could probably have in a lot of places in some of your larger components. Now this is going to work exactly the same as before. Now if you're used to class components and you haven't seen functional components as much, I do have an example of what this looks like as a class. It's pretty much the same thing. It's just more code, which is why if you're doing simple React components, I highly recommend to switch to functional components, and we can actually compare these side by side. When you're using a class, you have to reference this.props.whatever, and it just leads to a little bit of extra code. So we talked about props, things that you can pass into your component to modify or give additional functionality. Let's also talk about state. Now for this, I'm actually going to go back to a class component so you can see the full example of how you would go from a full class component to using hooks. So let's go back to props. We'll take this class component and we're going to use that instead for now. Okay, works exactly the same as the functional component, but now let's say that we had a requirement that we wanted to be able to filter items of our list. To do that, what we can do is keep track of what the filtered items are in state and provide some sort of input so that a user can change what those items are filtered. So first things first, we're going to need an input. So I'm going to use a fragment that allows me to place an input above the unordered list. Now I need a fragment because you can only return one child in this method. So the fragment allows us to get around that without having to put just a random div or a random span in your markup. So we have an input. We're going to need to look at the value on change. So when you type something in. So let's give it an on change property. And let's say we're going to make a new method that's going to allow us to filter items. So this dot filter items. Okay. We're going to create this method, filter items, and it's going to take in the event on change. And inside of here, we're going to do some filtering logic. But first, we need to set up the state. So to do that, we're going to use the class constructor. This takes in the initial props, and we have to call the React constructor because we're overriding that functionality, and we do that using super. Now you're probably thinking, okay, this is a little complex. Why do we need to do all this? And you'll see where we can get rid of a lot of this functionality by using hooks. So let's say this dot state is equal to some filtered items, and initially they're going to be the items that we pass in. So rather than iterating over the props directly here, now we're going to iterate over the state instead, and it's called filtered items instead of items. So we're going to do some logic inside of filter items to cut those down, and then we're going to iterate over the filtered ones instead. So initially, the initial state of this component, it starts out with the props of items. Now, inside of filter items, we're going to want to modify the state. And to do that, we need access to this. Now, to do that, we have to bind filter items to the class. And that's necessary to make this work in the callback. So we would need to do this dot filter items, which is that method, and say this dot filter items and bind it to this. So now we can use this inside of filter items. So we have, and now we can get rid of this lint error, by the way, because we're doing more than just rendering something out where we would need to use a stateless function. So we have access to the value that we typed in inside of filter items. Let's pull that out into a variable. We'll say that the search value is equal to e.target.value, where e is just short for event. So we have what the users typed in. Let's get the current items, the full list of items. And I'm going to show another ES6 feature here, which is spreading out items. So we're going to make a new array of items, and we're going to use this ... syntax to spread all of this .props.items into a new array. Effectively, what we're doing here is copying the array so that we don't modify the props directly. So we have the value, we have the current items. Now let's figure out which items are matching. So let's take the current items, and we're going to filter out the ones that don't match. Now, filter is a really helpful ES6 method that you can call on arrays. There's a lot of these. There's find, sum, every, includes, reduce. You can read about all these, but I found myself using filter quite a bit. So on the current items, we're going to say, given an item, we want to determine if that item starts with the search value. So now we know which items of the current items, aka the ones that were passed in, match the search value. So we have the matching items. Let's update the state to use these new items. So we're going to set filtered items to the matching items. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to save. And now let's go and right now there's no case insensitive on this search, so it's going to matter that I type a capital L. But you'll see as I start to type things, it filters down, and then when I delete, it goes back to things that don't match. Now, if you wanted to make this better, you could make it so it was case insensitive, which is a better search, or maybe do some kind of fuzzy match instead of just whether it starts with, because I would like to search, just React. But that's outside the bounds of this simple example. This is more just showing how you would use props and state to build your React components. But like I said, we can do better than this, and we can do that using a new-ish feature of React called React hooks. Now, React hooks allow us to get away from using class-based components and allow us to use functional components. And they do that using hooks into the quote-unquote lifecycle methods of React. So modifying state, doing things that you might have heard like component will update or component will receive props, or all of these React-specific lifecycle methods we can now achieve through hooks into React's API. So let's take this React component and let's transform it to use hooks instead. So first things first, we're going to make the list, and instead of doing this.props like we showed before, we can pull items out of the props and destructure it. Now, we don't need to worry about a constructor, but we want to have access to state. So let's do filtered items and then set filtered items. And here's where we're going to do react.useState. The initial value of our state are the items that we pass in. So what this syntax is it's saying, here's the value of state, and here is a function that's going to allow you to mutate that state. So rather than doing this.setState, we can use setFilteredItems. This makes it a little bit more clear because we're able to give it, well-defined variable names that make it more obvious. So this line number 4, is the same thing as doing this. And we actually don't need to bind filter items to a class anymore because we're using a functional component. So we can just get rid of this altogether. Now, filter items, let's take this and put it into the component. And we're going to have to change this syntax a little bit. So we're going to say filter items equals this anonymous function. And we still have access to the event. So we're going to get the search value. We're going to get the current items. We don't need to use this.props and find the matching items. And like I mentioned, instead of doing this.setState, now we can do setFilteredItems and pass in the matching items. And that is the exact same thing as doing this. So we have this, and then finally, instead of explicitly saying render, we can just return from this component to achieve the same effect. Now, we don't need to use this anymore, and filtered items is explicitly defined. So this is now the exact same thing as the class component. We're just using the useState hook instead, and it really simplifies things and just makes this a much better and easier to read component. And I think hooks are really, they're a mental model shift. It takes maybe a little bit to get used to doing things differently or how you previously did, but I really think it's the future of React, and it's changing how we do front-end development altogether. One other ES6 feature that I want to show is called Rest Spread. And really what I mean by that is getting the rest of the object or spreading an object. So if we think about props here, we pulled off items, but what if we wanted access to the rest of the props? What we can do is use that same ... notation to say props. Now we have a variable that's all of the rest of the props except for items that we pulled off. And now, let's say that when consuming this component, we wanted to be able to pass in labels and have those labels be applied to the list. So for this list, we're going to say, take the rest of those props and spread them out onto the unordered list. So now when we are using this list component, we could say something like, okay, put this area label of my fancy list and take this prop, pull it, and then spread it over the unordered list. So now when we refresh and we inspect this unordered list, we see that that area label has been applied. Okay, so that's a quick overview of React, getting you up to speed with some of the features that you may or may not have used, and to serve as kind of an introduction to this course so that you feel comfortable with the rest of the material that we talk about. So in this module, we've talked about classes, functional components, using props, using state, what React hooks look like, and finally some ES6 features that you might want to use in your React components. So with that, thanks for watching and stay tuned for the next module. Cheers.